This is my spot. You hear me, old man? Get up, now.
Sit anywhere else. You will not order me out of this chair. That's my answer. That empty chair belongs to a promise I've kept every 30 Friday for 40 years.
Reserved at 7:30. Keep the second cup warm. Who sent that?
The daughter of the man whose chair you claimed.
The worn brass plaque and the sealed envelope would eventually explain why 2 cups waited beneath that photograph. But neither clue had been fully understood, and Rex Dalton had not decided what he would do with Thomas Carter's refusal. 7 minutes earlier, before anyone knew the chair was tied to a 40-year promise, the Friday table had looked like nothing more than an old man, an empty seat, and 2 cups of black coffee. Thomas was 82, with pale blue eyes, neatly combed silver hair, and a faded denim jacket softened at the elbows. He moved with the compact care of a lifelong mechanic who had learned that force usually created a second problem. A brown cap rested beside his coffee as he checked the wall clock. 7:30, Megan Brooks said from behind the bar. Same as always. A little early is still on time, Thomas replied. Megan had managed the Iron Lantern for 6 years. The previous owner had given her one firm instruction on her first night. Keep the 2-chair table open after 7 every Friday. She honored the rule, even though she had never heard the full reason for it. That evening, a padded envelope addressed to Thomas waited beneath her register. It had arrived from Helena that afternoon with instructions not to open it before 7:30. Then 7 motorcycles rolled into the gravel lot. The riders who entered were road-worn rather than wild, dressed in black leather against the Montana wind. At their center was Rex, president of the Iron Wolves Riding Club. 6'4" with heavy shoulders and a thick gray beard, he carried the habit of entering a room as if he had already decided how everyone inside it would behave. Rex favored the back corner because its wall seat gave him a clear view of the front door, the parking lot, and every rider in his group. After almost 400 miles of crosswinds and disagreements, he expected that familiar seat to be one decision nobody questioned. Thomas was already occupying it. Rex's preference collided with Megan's house rule and Thomas's boundary. In less than a minute, every adult in the bar was watching. Nothing had become physical. Thomas did not mention the army, ask anyone to defend him, or use his age to win sympathy. He simply made his answer clear and left Rex responsible for the next choice. For the first time since entering, the biggest man in the room looked uncertain. His riders watched him. Megan remained beside the table. Thomas waited beside his coffee, neither challenging Rex nor retreating from him. The next move belonged to Rex. Rex did not take Thomas's chair. He also did not walk away. One of his riders dragged over a third chair from a nearby table, but Rex stopped him before he could set it beside the empty place. Not there, Thomas said. The younger rider looked to Rex, waiting for permission to ignore him. Megan answered first. He means it. Keep the aisle clear and leave that place setting alone. The rider moved the chair to the outer edge of the table. Rex lowered himself into it, his leather vest creaking as he folded his arms. Thomas remained standing with one hand on his own chair. All right, Rex said. You've got my attention. Tell me why a piece of furniture matters more than a room full of people. It doesn't, Thomas replied. People are why it matters. Rex gave a humorless laugh. That sounds convenient. It is inconvenient every Friday. That is how a promise stays honest. The answer drew a few quiet looks from the regulars. Most of them knew Thomas's routine. They knew Megan poured 2 coffees at 7:25, and they knew nobody sat at his table until he left. But familiarity had allowed them to stop asking why. Tonight, a stranger's rudeness had exposed their own indifference. Thomas sat again, slowly enough to protect his knee, but without accepting help. He placed his cap beside the first cup and straightened the second napkin. Rex watched the movement. Is the other man coming? Not through that door. Then the chair is empty. Thomas raised his eyes. Empty and available are not always the same thing. One of the riders snorted. A dead man can't care where anybody sits. Thomas turned toward him. His expression did not harden, but the warmth left it. No, he said. The living are the ones who decide whether his word still means anything. The young rider looked away. At the far end of the bar, Ethan Miller pushed aside an untouched plate and listened. He was 29 and had recently finished 8 years in the Marine Corps. He recognized nothing about Thomas's name, but he recognized the discipline in the old man's restraint. Thomas was not waiting to be rescued. He was giving Rex every possible chance to choose decency without being forced into it. Megan reached below the counter for the envelope, then hesitated. The return address belonged to N. Lawson, a name she did not know. Across the front, written in careful blue ink, were the words, "For Thomas Carter at the Friday table. Please wait until 7:30. The wall clock showed 7:26. Rex noticed Megan looking from the envelope to Thomas. "More ceremony?" "Mail," she said, "and none of your business." His eyebrows rose. Few people spoke to him that directly, but Megan owned the room in every way that mattered. She pointed toward a small sign behind the register. "No threats. No touching people or their property. Staff decides where groups sit. Those rules apply to everybody wearing boots." Rex glanced at his riders, then back at Thomas. "I haven't touched him." "Keep it that way," Megan said. Thomas gave her a grateful nod. He had not needed someone to speak for him, but he respected her willingness to speak for her own establishment. Rex leaned back. "You could have saved everyone this trouble by moving 3 feet. And you could have saved it by accepting the first no." The sentence landed without drama. Several customers lowered their eyes because they understood how often a simple boundary became an argument only when someone believed it did not apply to him. Rex rubbed a thumb over one of his silver rings. His group had ridden almost 400 miles through crosswinds that day. A missed turn had cost them an hour. 2 riders had argued at the last gas stop, and every decision had come to him. He had entered the bar carrying the strain of keeping 6 people together and mistaken that burden for authority over an 8th. He was not ready to admit it. 5 minutes, he said. "Tell the story, and maybe this stops looking foolish." Thomas checked the clock. Again, "The story starts at 7:30. "Why?" "Because that is when Richard always arrived." Rex looked toward the empty chair. "And until then?" Thomas reached into the inside pocket of his denim jacket and removed a worn brass Zippo. He set it between the 2 coffee cups without opening it. "Until then," he said, "we wait." The lighter was scratched, dented at one corner, and dull from decades of handling. Its brass surface caught the amber light above the table, revealing an engraving worn almost smooth. Lane, the youngest rider in Rex's group, leaned forward to read it. "T, C, and R, L," he said. "That's it." Thomas placed one finger beside the lighter. "That is enough." Lane grinned at the others. "Looks like something from a pawn shop." Before Megan could object, he picked it up. Thomas's chair moved back an inch. "Put it down." He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for Lane's wrist. Yet the words carried a firmer edge than anything he had said to Rex. The lighter was not part of the argument, and Thomas would not allow another man to turn it into a prop. Lane rolled it across his palm. "Relax. I'm only looking. You were not given permission." Rex studied Thomas, then looked at the lighter in Lane's hand. A choice passed across his face. He could protect his pride by letting the insult continue, or he could lead the men who had come in with him. "Set it down, Lane," he said. The grin vanished. "Rex, I wasn't going to," he asked once. Lane returned the Zippo to the exact place where he had found it. Thomas picked it up, checked the hinge, and closed his fingers around it for a moment. "Thank you," he said to Rex. Rex shifted in the 3rd chair. The gratitude made him more uncomfortable than anger would have. "Don't mistake that for taking sides. I don't need sides. I need men to be responsible for their choices." Megan poured fresh coffee into Thomas's cup. The 2nd cup had begun to cool, but he asked her to leave it alone until 7:30. Outside, the wind pushed dry leaves across the parking lot, and the motorcycles ticked softly as their engines cooled. Rex nodded toward the lighter. "Did Richard give you that?" "He did." "For what?" Thomas turned it so the engraving faced them. Beneath the initials was a line so faint that Lane had missed it. "For the man who got U.S. home." The wall clock advanced another minute. 1968, Thomas said. "Fort Lewis, Washington. I was a wheeled vehicle mechanic in the United States Army." Richard Lawson was a young lieutenant who believed a schedule was a law of nature. A few smiles appeared around the room. Was he wrong? Rex asked. Frequently. He was also willing to learn. Thomas did not slip into the distant stare people expected from an old veteran telling a service story. He stayed in the bar, aware of the cups, the listeners, and the man across from him. His memory belonged to him. He chose how much of it to share. He described a cold training week east of the mountains, where rain turned hard ground to mud, and every piece of equipment seemed to collect water. A transport truck lost electrical power near the end of the return route. The problem was ordinary, but the timing was bad. Night was coming, the temperature was falling, and several vehicles behind it could not safely move until the lane was clear. Richard wanted the truck towed immediately. Thomas asked for 10 minutes to inspect it first. He thought I was stalling, Thomas said. I thought he was letting his rank do his thinking. Rex's eyes narrowed at the parallel, but Thomas continued without looking at him. Using an issued flashlight and a meter, Thomas traced the fault to a damaged ground strap hidden beneath grime near the battery box. He isolated the electrical system, made a safe field repair, and had the truck ready to move before the recovery vehicle arrived. There was no dramatic rescue and no secret act of heroism. A mechanic noticed a small defect, followed procedure, and did his job. That doesn't sound like a legend, Lane said. It isn't, Thomas replied. Most things that get people home are not. Later, after the vehicles were secured and every soldier had been accounted for, Richard found Thomas in the motor pool. He placed his own lighter on the workbench. He told me he'd spent the day giving orders, Thomas said, but the best decision he made was listening when a man with dirty hands told him to wait. Richard had the lighter engraved before their unit separated. The sentence was too grand for Thomas's taste, but Richard refused to take it back. Rex read the faint words again. So the lieutenant owed you. Thomas shook his head. No, we learned to trust each other. Debt keeps score. Friendship keeps showing up. The minute hand reached 7:29. Thomas set the lighter beside the second cup and looked toward the door. What happened after the army? Rex asked. Thomas's expression softened. That is why there are 2 chairs, he said. Thomas and Richard took different roads after leaving the army. Thomas returned to Montana and worked in a municipal garage, then spent 30 years keeping school buses running through winters that punished careless maintenance. Richard went into the building trade and moved from state to state before a highway project brought him to Billings. They found each other again in 1983, not through a ceremony or an official record, but because Richard's pickup needed a starter and someone recommended Thomas's shop. He walked in, put that lighter on my counter, and asked whether I still needed 10 minutes, Thomas said. The line earned the first honest laugh of the night, including a reluctant one from Rex. That Friday, they met at the Iron Lantern for coffee. The bar was smaller then, and the photograph above the table was still new. It showed Thomas, Richard, and several men from their old maintenance company after a field exercise. They were young, tired, and pleased to be standing beside a truck that finally ran the way it should. At first, 5 veterans met at the table. Then 4. Work schedules changed, families moved, and distance made weekly promises difficult. Thomas and Richard kept coming. They did not talk only about the army. They compared repair jobs, complained about the weather, helped one another fill out tax forms, celebrated children and grandchildren, and noticed when the other man looked as if he should not drive home alone. The coffee was an excuse, Thomas explained. The real promise was that neither of us would disappear without someone noticing. Rex stopped rubbing his ring. Thomas continued. When the bar changed owners, Richard paid for a small brass plaque beneath the photograph. It reserved the table on Fridays at 7:30, but not as a private monument. If someone came in alone and needed company, Thomas and Richard pulled over a 3rd chair. A stranded trucker once waited out a blizzard with them. A newly widowed rancher joined them for 6 months without being asked to explain himself. A teenager whose car had broken down used their phone, drank hot chocolate, and left with a safe ride home. Then why guard the empty chair? Rex asked. If the whole point was making room? Because making room has to be a choice, Thomas said. It cannot begin with one person taking what belongs to another. The clock clicked to 7:30. Thomas lifted his cup. He held it toward the chair across from him, not like a toast for an audience, but like the completion of a familiar greeting. Evening, Richard. Then he took one sip. No one in the bar spoke. The quiet lasted only a few seconds, because Thomas had never intended to turn grief into a performance. He lowered the cup and nodded to Megan. She brought out the envelope. This arrived for you today, she said. The note says you should open it now. Thomas recognized the return address. And is Richard's daughter. Were you expecting something? No. He turned the envelope over. A second line had been written beneath the seal. Please wait for me. Headlights swept across the front windows, but the vehicle continued past. Thomas left the envelope unopened on the table. Rex looked again at the second cup. How long has Richard been gone? 11 months. And you still pour his coffee every week. Megan pours it. I complain when she overfills it. Megan smiled. He complains whether I do or not. The small joke loosened the room, but Rex did not smile this time. 11 months is a lot of coffee. 40 years is a lot of Fridays. Thomas reached beneath the photograph and wiped dust from the narrow plaque with his handkerchief. The inscription appeared one line at a time. Friday table. Reserved at 7:30. Keep the second cup warm. There were no ranks, medals, or grand claims. Only a time and an instruction. Megan stared at it. I knew the rule. I never read the last line. People stop seeing what never moves, Thomas said. Ethan left his place at the bar and approached only far enough to read the plaque. Mr. Carter, may I ask a question? Thomas nodded. Did you keep coming after Richard could no longer drive? I drove him. When he no longer wanted to make the trip, I brought coffee to his porch. The table was never the important part. That answer changed the story. The chair was not proof that Thomas could endure loss. It was proof that he had adapted the promise while Richard was still alive. Rex looked down at the floor. He had entered believing the best seat belonged to the strongest person in the room. Now he was sitting beside evidence that strength might be measured by how faithfully someone made space for another. He lifted his eyes to Thomas. You could have told me all of that when I asked you to move. Thomas folded his handkerchief. I told you the chair mattered, he said. You were deciding whether that should be enough. Rex's face tightened, not with the anger that had filled it earlier, but with the discomfort of a man who had run out of excuses. You think I walk around taking whatever I want? Thomas considered the question instead of using it as an opening to humiliate him. I think you did tonight. The direct answer silenced Rex's riders. Lane looked at the Zippo and kept both hands around his own glass. Rex leaned forward. I keep my group together. On the road, I choose fuel stops, routes, rooms, tables. If something goes wrong, everyone looks at me. That sounds like responsibility, Thomas said. It is. Responsibility for your people is not authority over everyone else. Rex sat back as if the distinction had weight. He explained that the wall seat let him see the motorcycles and the door. He had used it during 3 previous stops at the Iron Lantern, and nobody had objected. After a hard day on the highway, he had walked toward the familiar corner expecting one thing to go the way he wanted. When you didn't move, he said, it felt like you were challenging me in front of my men. Thomas looked toward the 6 riders. Did any of them ask you to prove something? No one answered. That is what I thought, Thomas said. Rex glanced at Megan. Why didn't you just say the table had a plaque? I said it was reserved, she replied. You decided the explanation had to satisfy you before the rule counted. The big man let out a long breath. He had not been surrounded by enemies. He had been surrounded by people giving him the same answer in plain language. He rose from the 3rd chair. Several customers tensed, but Thomas remained seated. Rex picked up the chair, carried it to the next table, and set it down carefully. Then he returned to the corner and stepped away from both reserved seats. Your spot is yours, he said. Thomas shook his head. My time here is mine. The chair belongs to the bar, and the promise belongs to 2 men. Words matter. Rex nodded once. Then I was out of line. It was not yet an apology. It was, however, the first time he had named his own conduct without blaming the ride, the room, or Thomas. Lane cleared his throat. I shouldn't have picked up the lighter. No, Thomas said. You shouldn't have. Lane waited for the old man to soften the answer for him. Thomas did not. I'm sorry, Lane added. Thomas looked at him for a moment. Thank you for returning it. Next time, ask before curiosity turns into entitlement. Lane nodded. Megan placed both palms on the bar. Here is what happens now. You can stay if you respect the table, my staff, and everyone else in this room. If that is too difficult, you settle your tab and leave. Rex answered immediately. We stay by the rules. It mattered that the decision belonged to Megan. Thomas did not pardon behavior in a business he did not own, and Megan did not make him responsible for keeping the peace. The riders moved to a larger table near the pool tables. Their voices dropped to the same level as everyone else's. Rex remained standing at the edge of the corner, far enough away to return Thomas's space, but close enough to show he had not escaped the conversation. Why keep the chair under that photograph, he asked. Thomas pointed to the young faces above them. So memory has to share a room with ordinary life. Richard hated memorials that made people whisper. He wanted to hear bad jokes, bottles clinking, and somebody arguing about football. Sounds like a biker bar. It sounds like people. Rex almost smiled. Ethan approached Megan and quietly asked whether the photograph could be lowered so the engraving on its back could be checked. He did not claim special knowledge or begin calling strangers in authority. He had simply noticed 2 small screws at the bottom of the frame and a date written behind the glass. Megan retrieved a step stool and inspected it without removing the photograph from the wall. On the lower edge of the frame, hidden above eye level, someone had written, "First Friday, October 7th, 1983. Tonight is the first Friday of October," she said. Thomas looked at the date, genuinely surprised. "I stopped counting anniversaries." Rex turned toward the unopened envelope. "Maybe Richard's daughter didn't," he said. At that moment, a blue sedan entered the parking lot and stopped beside the motorcycles. A woman with silver threaded through her dark hair stepped out carrying a narrow cedar box against her chest. Thomas rose before she reached the door. This time, nobody mistook the movement for the beginning of a fight. The woman entered with rain on the shoulders of her coat and looked directly toward the table beneath the photograph. "Mr. Carter?" Thomas smiled. "And Lawson, you have your father's eyes," and crossed the room and embraced him. Thomas accepted the hug, then stepped back on his own and studied the cedar box. "You drove from Helena in this weather?" "Dad would say I was 11 months late. Your father was usually early only when he wanted credit for it," and laughed through a breath she had been holding. The sound made the empty chair feel connected to a person rather than a symbol. Megan handed her the padded envelope and asked Thomas to open it. Inside was a short note and a small key tied to a piece of blue string. The key fit the cedar box. "I mailed the key because I wasn't sure I could make the drive," and explained. "Then, this morning I realized I would regret letting a package keep the promise for me." Rex began to return to his group, but Thomas stopped him. "You wanted the story," he said. "You should hear the part Richard chose to leave." Rex did not move closer. "Only if she agrees," and looked from Rex to the shifted chair and the riders gathered across the room. She understood that something had happened, though not what. "Dad believed people could learn," she said. "Stay." The box contained no medals. On top lay a stack of coffee receipts held together with a rubber band. Beneath them were Polaroids from the Iron Lantern, Thomas and Richard with a snowbound trucker, a rancher smiling over a slice of pie, Megan on her first week behind the bar, and dozens of ordinary customers crowded around a table designed for 2. At the bottom sat a black pocket calendar from 1983. Every Friday after October 7th carried the same 2 initials. Some dates had a third name. A few had 4. And turned the pages slowly. "Dad kept this in his desk," she said. "After he died, I thought it was an appointment book. Then I realized the names were people you 2 met here." Thomas recognized some immediately. Others took time. "Harold," he said, touching one faded entry. "His truck slid into a ditch during a snowstorm. He waited here until the county cleared the road." Another name belonged to a young mother whose bus connection had been canceled. One belonged to a cook who had received difficult news and did not want to go home to an empty apartment. The table had never been a private shrine. The unused chair honored Richard, while the extra chairs around it had carried the promise forward, and lifted a sealed envelope from beneath the calendar. Thomas's name was written across it in Richard's uneven hand. "He wrote this during his last week at home," she said. "He made me promise to deliver it on the first Friday of October, 40 years after you started the table." Megan glanced at the date on the frame. "That is tonight," and nodded. "I almost waited another week. Then I decided being frightened of this room was not a reason to break the promise." Thomas pulled out the chair beside him. Not Richard's chair, but the third one Rex had moved to the next table. "Then sit down," he said. "Keeping it still counts when it is difficult." Rex carried the chair over only after Thomas nodded permission, and sat, and Thomas opened the letter. He read silently at first. His face changed with each line. Amusement, recognition, and finally a quiet sadness that he did not hide. When he finished, he handed the page to Anne. "Would you read the last paragraph?" he asked, and faced Thomas, not the room. "Tom, if my chair ever causes more trouble than comfort, remind people why we left it open. It was never there to make anyone feel small. It was there to make us ask who was missing, who was alone, and who needed somebody to notice. Protect the promise, but do not turn it into a wall. If the table needs another chair, add one. The bar remained quiet, but the silence was no longer built from fear. People were listening because the words demanded a decision from everyone who had watched the night unfold. Rex stared at the chair he had claimed. I turned it into a wall before I even knew what it was, he said. Thomas folded Richard's letter along its original crease. You tried to. Megan stopped you. Then you chose to stop yourself. That distinction did not excuse Rex. It gave him responsibility for what came next. And finally asked, what happened before I arrived? Rex answered before anyone else could protect him from the truth. I ordered him out of his seat. When he said no, I treated his boundary like an insult. One of my men took the lighter without asking, and I waited too long before correcting it. And looked at Thomas. Are you all right? I am, he said, and I would like to hear what Rex intends to do with what he understands now. I returned to the biggest man in the room. Rex walked to the center of the bar, then stopped. He did not remove his vest for effect, lower his head for sympathy, or ask Thomas to make the moment easier. Mr. Carter, he said, I owe you a clear apology. Thomas waited. I claimed your chair because I expected size and noise to settle the question. I ignored Megan's rule. I treated your no as something I could negotiate, and I let one of my riders handle property that wasn't his. I was wrong. He turned toward Megan. I disrespected your staff and your business too. If you want us gone, we'll pay and leave. Megan studied him. I told you the condition for staying. So far, you're finally meeting it. Rex nodded, then looked back at Thomas. I'm sorry. Thomas did not answer immediately. Forgiveness was not a line Rex could demand on the schedule that suited him. I accept the apology, Thomas said at last. That doesn't make the first half of the night disappear. I know. Good. Then you can learn from the whole night. Not only the part that makes you feel better. Rex accepted that without defense. Lane rose from the rider's table. Mr. Carter, I'm sorry too. I picked up the lighter because I thought an old thing in a bar couldn't matter that much. Thomas held the Zippo in his open palm. Its age isn't why you should have left it alone. I understand. Why then? Because it wasn't mine. Thomas closed his hand. That will do. And placed Richard's pocket calendar beside the two cups. The time for explanation had ended. Now came the ritual itself. Thomas poured a little fresh coffee into Richard's cup and told one story about him. Not the story of a uniform, a rank, or a difficult road, but the story of a man who once spent 20 minutes insisting a diner had shorted him a nickel before discovering the coin stuck to his own elbow. The first laugh came from Anne. Thomas joined her. Soon Megan was laughing, then Ethan, then several ranch hands. Even Rex's beard lifted around a reluctant smile. Richard's memory did not require the room to remain solemn. It required the room to remember him accurately. When the laughter settled, Thomas raised Richard's cup an inch and returned it to the table. Appointment kept, he said. Only then did he look at Rex. There is a third chair now. Rex glanced at Anne. That belongs to his daughter. Tonight it did. She has another table waiting whenever she wants it. The question is whether you know how to ask. Rex approached, but stopped beyond the table's edge. May I sit with you? Thomas looked toward Anne. She nodded. You may, he said. Rex brought the third chair over, leaving enough space around Richard's empty place. He sat without taking command of the table. His riders remained where they were, allowing their president to face the consequences of his conduct without turning the apology into a group performance. For several minutes, the three of them spoke quietly. Rex explained that he had spent years confusing leadership with control. On the road, quick decisions could keep a group organized. Off the road, he sometimes carried the same tone into rooms where nobody had chosen to follow him. It works often enough that a man can mistake compliance for respect, Thomas said. Rex looked at the chair beneath him. How do you know the difference? Respect stays after people are free to leave. Rex let that answer stand. Ethan had taken out his phone earlier, thinking the photograph and the two cups might be worth recording. Now he slipped it back into his pocket. Thomas noticed. Thank you, he said. For what? For not turning this into content before asking whether it was yours to share. Ethan nodded. It isn't. Thomas looked around the room. The lesson can travel. Our faces don't have to. That boundary mattered as much as the chair. Nobody photographed the letter, the lighter, or Anne's grief. The people present would remember the evening, but Thomas would decide what part of his life became public. Before and left, she gave him Richard's letter and asked Megan to keep the pocket calendar with the framed photograph. Megan agreed only after Thomas approved. Rex stood and extended his hand. Thomas looked at it, then rose without hurry and accepted it. The handshake was brief. It did not crown a winner. It confirmed that both men understood the boundary that had been crossed and the standard that would follow. Outside, rain began tapping against the windows. Rex looked toward the motorcycles, then back at the old veteran. "Same time next Friday?" he asked. Thomas put on his brown cap. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "Whether you remember that asking comes before sitting." During the week that followed, nobody at the Iron Lantern turned Friday night into a legend. Megan refused 2 requests from customers who wanted to photograph the table after hearing a partial version of the story. She cleaned the brass plaque, lowered it to eye level, and added 1 plain card approved by Thomas and Anne, reserved Fridays at 7:30. Asked before joining. Richard's pocket calendar went into a shallow frame beside the old photograph. The Zippo went home in Thomas's jacket. Nothing was displayed to prove that Thomas deserved respect. The table explained a practice, not a pedigree. Rex spent that week thinking about how quickly he had used the words "my spot." He had meant a chair, but the phrase exposed a larger habit. He claimed the head of every table, decided when conversations ended, and treated disagreement from his riders as disloyalty. None of those habits made him stronger. They merely trained people to become quiet around him. At the next club meeting, he began with the same directness he had finally shown Thomas. "If I ask what you think," he told the riders, "I am going to let you finish." Lane laughed, expecting a joke. Rex waited until he understood it was not one. Then Lane asked the question Rex had been avoiding. "Would you have moved if there hadn't been a plaque and a letter?" Rex looked around the clubhouse before answering. "I should have stopped when he said no." The plaque explained the chair. It did not create his right to set a boundary. That distinction became the part Rex repeated to himself. Thomas's army service, Richard's promise, and 40 years of coffee made the truth memorable. None of them were prerequisites for basic respect. The following Friday, the Iron Wolves arrived at 7:15. Their engines were no quieter, their jackets no less worn, and Rex was still the largest man through the door. Change had not transformed him into someone unrecognizable. It had changed what he did with the space he occupied. A traveling salesman had just pulled out Thomas's chair. Rex approached him. The room noticed and prepared for the old pattern. Instead of barking, Rex stopped at a respectful distance. "Excuse me," he said. "I believe that table is reserved at 7:30. Megan can help us find another place." The traveler checked the card, apologized, and moved willingly. No one froze. No one had to. Rex and his riders took the table by the pool tables. He left the 3rd chair where it was. Thomas arrived 5 minutes later, silver hair damp from the light rain. He nodded to Megan, greeted the regulars, and crossed the room without ceremony. 2 fresh coffees waited beneath the photograph. Rex stood, but he did not approach until Thomas had removed his coat, checked the 2nd place setting, and taken the first sip of his own coffee. Then he stopped beside the table. "May I?" Thomas glanced at the 3rd chair. That is how it should have started. Rex Saturday. Their first conversation was awkward. Rex knew engines, but not army maintenance, and Thomas knew nothing about organizing a group ride. That gave them practical things to discuss. They compared tire wear, weather reports, and the difference between a machine that sounded powerful and one that was actually running well. On later Fridays, and joined them when she could, Ethan occasionally pulled over a 4th chair. Megan made sure the 2nd cup remained untouched until Thomas completed the appointment. After that, the table opened by invitation, just as Richard's letter requested. Rex never became the guardian of Thomas's chair. Thomas would not have wanted one domineering man replaced by another who claimed authority in his name. Instead, Rex practiced something harder. When a newcomer reached for the seat, he pointed out the reservation politely. If someone asked about it, he let Thomas decide whether to tell the story. If the old veteran wanted silence, Rex respected that too. The Iron Wolves changed one club habit. On the last Friday of each month, they paid for coffee at an extra table and left its chairs open for anyone who did not want to sit alone. They did not name the gesture after Thomas, post photographs, or turn it into a ceremony. They simply made room. Months later, on the first warm Friday of spring, Thomas arrived to find every table occupied except the one beneath the photograph. Richard's cup waited in its usual place. The third chair had been left slightly back, available but not assumed. Rex stood near the bar talking with Megan. When he saw Thomas, he did not announce him. He just lifted his coffee in greeting. Thomas sat, touched 2 fingers to the worn Zippo in his pocket, and checked the clock. At 7:30, he raised the second cup. Evening, Richard. The conversations around him continued. Bottles clinked. Someone missed an easy shot at the pool table. A bad joke drew a loud groan from the writers. It was exactly the ordinary life Richard had wanted the promise to share. After the first sip, Thomas looked toward Rex and nodded at the third chair. Rex approached. "Still all right if I join you?" "Yes." As he sat, a new customer asked why one chair stayed empty when the bar was full. Rex started to answer, then looked to Thomas. Thomas smiled. "It belongs to a promise," he said. "But we can bring you another chair." The customer accepted. Megan carried one over, and the table widened again. The biggest man in the bar had once believed respect meant everyone knowing where he sat. The old veteran showed him that respect was knowing where another person stood, listening when that person said no, and making room without taking what had never been offered. A chair could be claimed in a sentence. Trust took longer. At the Iron Lantern, they practiced it every Friday.